Okay, so we're live now. And last class we ended not quite finished with the speech in praise of Abraham. And I don't want to spend much more time on it. Honestly, I think we kind of got the gist of it. Let us review it a little bit. And then today what we're going to do is we're going to move on to the first problemata, the only problemata that I think we're going to cover. We'll see, there's 3 problemata, but for our class for this semester, we only really are probably going to have time for the first one, and we're not really reading the whole thing. I actually cut it short. There's a few pages missing, but we'll get started on that today. It's titled The Preamble from the Heart. So we'll get started on that today, and we'll probably be working our way through it all week next week. And I'm thinking that by the end of the week next week, we will be finished with Kierkegaard. If there's enough interest, we might go further. But as Kierkegaard sometimes says, we shouldn't go further, right? We should just stop with faith and don't go further, right? That's the goal, is, not to go further. So we'll decide whether we want to go further or not when we get to that point. And I'm thinking that's going to be at the end of the week next week. If we want to read parts of the second problemata, the one that has not a very inviting title, the teleological, is there a teleological suspension of the ethical? This is actually one of the most famous passages from Fear and Trembling. So if there's enough class interest and our time isn't constrained, I'm not opposed to moving on. But if we don't, we're just going to move on to Bertrand Russell, a short article or essay by Bertrand Russell, and then get ready for Vonnegut. So that's kind of the game plan. But I'm looking at my book, because that is faster for me. I think where we left off on 54. No, 52. No, I'm right, 54. I was right first. We were on page 54. And let me get that PDF file open, actually, so that we can all look at it together on the screen if we want. Oh, where? Oh, I'm in the wrong folder. Okay. For some reason, it takes my computer. Well, my computer's just slow at pretty much everything. Oh, that was fast. I was going to say sometimes Acrobat takes forever to open the file, but that was relatively quick. So let me share my screen with you guys, and then we'll be off to the races. So, as I said, we'll briefly review the story so far. In the preface, which was sort of the second day of class, we got into the preface, day 2. We get this reflection on modern philosophy and the distinction between modern philosophy and ancient philosophy. And he brings Descartes into the discussion as a sort of example of a man who was filled with true, authentic doubt. But our writer, Johannes de Silencio, seems sarcastically to doubt. He doubts the doubt, or the sincerity of the doubt of his contemporaries. They seem to just doubt as a philosophical exercise. It's not in their blood the way it was for Descartes. And Descartes himself was a sort of man of faith. Put some quotation marks, I suppose, around that. But Descartes didn't lack faith, and he gives all sorts of evidence for this. And that there's something about Descartes' doubt that is akin to faith, and it's something that's inside, that it's visceral. And other comments too, which we'll probably have to revisit at the end of our exploration of Kierkegaard. A critical view of the modern age seems to be operating under the surface here throughout the reading. And we get this in the preface with these comments on a clearance sale of ideas and how everything's being sold so cheaply that we're not even sure if anybody wants to even make a bid. And the idea that the modern age is an age bereft of passion faith itself is a passion, and perhaps one of the most intense forms of passion. And then we move on to the next section, attunement, where we get these 4 attunements, these 4 different ways of approaching the story of Abraham, because Abraham is going to serve for Johannes as the paradigmatic case of faith. What is it to be a man of faith? But the more he tries to understand the story of Abraham, the more he tries to attune himself with it and make sense of it, the less sense it makes. And so these are all different attempts that somehow fail. They all fall short of faith. And each one of them is accompanied by some, sort of interesting metaphor of the mother weaning the child off of the breast. And I don't want to comment on it now because we got so much to cover, but if you go look at the YouTube comments, my friend Danielle, he's a buddy of mine I met through my meetup group. He's a physicist or a physics, at least a grad student in physics at Rice, but he's very fascinated by philosophy. He commented on the 4th attunement that we were sort of having trouble with last time, and I really like his take on it. He used some quote from the Bible or a passage from, I think, the Gospel of Matthew towards the end, and I thought it was a pretty spot-on reading of the 4th attunement, mentioning of solid food. But last class, we wrapped up the attunement and we got deep into the speech and praise of Abraham, which begins with this sort of tripartite relationship between the poet, the hero, and then the speech maker and the hero, right? So the idea that the speech maker, what is it? How does he put it? Let me zoom in here because this is really small print. The hero is the speech maker's better nature, whereas the poet is the better nature of the hero. The idea being that the hero speaks for all. He speaks in front of his neighbor's door. He speaks in the voice of the ethical, to keep with Kierkegaard's terminology, in terms of right and wrong, universal terms, Hegelian terms, Hegel, the German philosopher. Ways that can be universally expressed of the hero. And so he's drawing from his own soul, his own self, his own experience. This is me, but even better. This is the better parts of my soul, but further developed to its fullest potential in this other man, this other hero figure. The poet taps into something unique, though. And that's why I suppose he says that the poet is the hero's better nature, whereas the hero is the speech maker's better nature. And then he moves on to the actual story of Abraham. We get to actually talk about a little bit about the story and why is the story so difficult to grapple with. He's in a way maybe transitioning still from the attunement section. So let's go where we left off. We left off, like I said, it's at the top of page 52. I have underlined there, it is great to grasp hold of the eternal, but greater to stick to the temporal after having given it up. So he's characterizing what Abraham is doing as that second thing, sticking to the temporal after having given it up, sticking to something, not going beyond it. This is a theme that keeps recurring. He stopped at faith, stuck to it. He didn't go beyond it. He worked his whole life to be stuck in that. But it's great. It's not that he's discounting this other option. The other option is to grasp hold of the eternal, to have a glimpse of what it is to have a universal value, but it's greater, even greater. So I suppose you could maybe say this is a backhanded compliment to Hegel and the other philosophers. Yeah, it's really great what you did. It's not completely, I'm not dismissing science, not dismissing rationality. I'm not dismissing making sense of things. In a sense that I think this is a backhanded compliment to Hegel, but like all things in this reading, it's a double entendre. I think there's layers to this. This is also speaking to each of us personally, I think. We can all of us grasp hold of the eternal. We can all be a part of a movement that's bigger than us. We can join a political movement, a party. We can be part of the revolution, viva la revolution, whatever, right? We can join a church or whatnot. That's certainly a good thing, a noble cause, you might say. But what Abraham did is different somehow. Faith is something even unique, and it's involved in the temporal. This is something that I think is what also makes it difficult to maybe grasp a hold of, is because it's not as otherworldly as the word faith and infinite might lead you to believe. That when Abraham has faith, he gets his reward not in some afterlife, but here in the temporal, right? Then came the fullness of time. Had Abraham not had faith, then Sarah would surely have died of sorrow, and Abraham, dull with grief, instead of understanding the fulfillment, would have smiled at it as at a youthful dream. But Abraham believed, and therefore he was young. So I'm going to skip the rest of that paragraph because I think we dug into it, right? There's something about faith that it's sort of a maintaining of a youthfulness. Even though Abraham was like 100 or whatever he was, how old he was when he had Isaac, he had this eternal youth because he was able to keep this fullness of faith unwaveringly. So there was rejoicing in Abraham's house when Sarah was the bride on their golden wedding day. It was not to remain so. Abraham was to be tried. Then we get into the whole trial, right? And all this stuff, right? This despair, all was lost. For yes, and I'm kind of close to the bottom here, page 55. For yes, Abraham would indeed take leave of Isaac, but it was not he that was to remain. Death would divide them, and Isaac was be his victim. Right? This was what was being proposed. This is what was being put forward. This is what was testing and trying Abraham's faith. Skipping to the bottom there. But Abraham had faith and had faith for this life. Yes. He had his faith. Had his faith only been for a future life, it would have indeed been easier to cast everything aside in order to hasten out of this world to which he did not belong. But Abraham's faith was not of that kind. If there is such, for faith like that is not really faith. It's only its remotest possibility. A faith that has some inkling of its object at the very edge of the field of vision, but remains separated from it by a yawning abyss in which despair, failure to grasp faith, failure to be oneself, as Kierkegaard puts it elsewhere. Despair plays its pranks. It was for this life that Abraham believed. He believed he'd become old in this land, honored among his people, blessed in his kin, eternally remembered in Isaac, the dearest in his life, whom he embraced with a love for which it was but a poor expression to say that he faithfully fulfilled the Father's duty to love the Son, as indeed the Son has put it, the Son whom thou lovest. So this is a sort of paradox. He loves, he doesn't dislove Isaac. He loves Isaac as a father should and does. And yet he's willing to sacrifice Isaac. But Abraham had faith and did not doubt. He believed the absurd. This is, I could be wrong. Somebody jump in and correct me if you know of an earlier passage where this word is brought in. He says that Abraham had faith and did not doubt. He believed the absurd. There's something about having faith that one has belief, one has power, one has passion in virtue of the absurd. Right? And so Abraham has this absurd belief that he will sacrifice Isaac and he will keep Isaac. How is that true? You can't have both. You can't have your cake and eat it too, as the old adage goes. But yet he believes it. He believes in an absurdity. So for Kierkegaard, he's one to very much push back on many approaches to religion and theology that try to make sense and rationalize what ultimately cannot be rationalized. He thinks this is the lesson of the Bible. This is the lesson of Christianity. It's not a universal. Faith is a personal and unique and irreducible experience. We all have our own Isaac. And understanding what Isaac meant to Abraham is impossible. We can't grapple it with dialectics. We can sort of try to approach it with dialectics, with rational thinking, but ultimately, the best we can do is shrug our shoulders and, I guess, maybe approach it through poetry. Remember, the subtitle to this is a dialectical lyric. So Abraham doubted, if Abraham had doubted, then he would have done something else, right? But he didn't doubt. He believed in virtue of the absurd, something great and glorious. So again, he's not dissing you if you are a devout, occult, I hate to say that word because it has like bad negative connotations, but a follower. You're somebody who adheres to a creed that has been sort of bestowed upon you by tradition, society. He's not completely shitting on that. But what he's saying is this is not the same thing as faith. This is not the same thing as what we're talking about when we talk about what Abraham must have done and must have lived and must have felt and experienced to truly have been religious, father of faith. So he would have marched out to the mountain. He would have done something else. If he would have doubted, if he didn't have faith, he would have done something else. Something great and glorious, but how could he have done that other than what was great and glorious? He would have marched out to the Mount Moriah, chopped the firewood, set light to the fire, drawn the light. He would have cried out to God, "Don't scorn the sacrifice. It's not the best I possess, that I well know. For what is an old man compared with the child of promise? But it is the best I can give. Let Isaac never come to know that he may comfort himself in his young years." And then Abraham would have thrust the knife into his own breast. He would have been admired in the world and his name never forgotten. But it is one thing to be admired, another to be a guiding star that saves the anguish. Admiration is what the speech maker has for the hero. But being astonished, being a guiding star that saves the anguished, that's something different. That's what Abraham has done. If he would have done like he says, you know what, God, I know you told me to kill Isaac, but man, I can't do that. Here's the second, I'll kill myself. That makes sense. He sacrificed, still kind of crazy. It's kind of nuts, but it makes sense. Okay. God demanded a sacrifice of him. The deed was too heinous for him to go through with it, so he killed himself. That makes sense. We can couch that in terms of the ethical. And that's still an amazing feat, but it's not a guiding star that saves the anguished, as he puts it. Very dramatic language here. But Abraham had faith. He did not beg for himself in hope of moving the Lord, right? He wasn't rationally consoling with God. It was only that time when the just punishment had been proclaimed upon Sodom and Gomorrah that he came forward with his prayers. So he says he had done it before. If you're familiar with that story from the Bible of Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham did plead with God and tried to reason with God because God was going to completely, destroy all the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah. He was going to smite them all. And Abraham said, "No, I know a righteous man." God said, "Look, if you can find 50 righteous men, I'll let you save Sodom and Gomorrah." And he says, "Well, can I maybe just do 25?" And God's like, "Yeah, 25, sure." He's like, "Well, maybe can I do 5?" He keeps it goes way longer than that. They go back and forth. There's like a debate. There's a dialectic. There's a sort of back and forth trying to get at a reasonable, okay. And then God says, "Find one righteous man, just one righteous man in Sodom and Gomorrah, and I'll spare them." And he finds his cousin Lot or whatever. So Abraham is not beyond reasoning with God, but he doesn't do that in this case. He carries out, he fulfills this trial, right? He fulfills this request unflinchingly with faith. And we read in the Holy Scriptures, God tempted Abraham, said to him, and then there's that passage again from the Bible. You to whom the speech is addressed, was that you? Actually, let me read that whole darn thing. What did I do? Let me figure out how the heck I got that squiggle on the screen, because it's bugging me. But it looks like it's that's a permanent fixture of my PDF file now. I have no idea how that happened, but that little red squiggle is something we're just gonna have to work around. Sorry. Okay, so we read in Holy Scriptures, and God did tempt Abraham, said unto him, Abraham, Abraham, where are you? But Abraham answered, here I am. You to whom my speech is addressed, was that the case with you? When you saw far off the heavy fate approaching, did you, and this is, Johannes is addressing us, I guess. He said, did you say to the mountains, hide me, to the hills, fall on me? Or if you were stronger, did your feet nevertheless drag along the way? Right? In other words, were you unwilling to see this story for what it is, and all of its ugliness, and all of its fear and loathing, or fear and trembling, fear and loathing, freaking Hunter S. Thompson. Yeah, all of its fear and trembling, like all of its, or did you sugarcoat it too? Did you try to give it some sort of ethical interpretation? Did your feet nevertheless drag along the way? Did they not hanker, as it were, to get back into the old tracks? When you were called, right? So, and this is another, I don't think he uses this phrase quite as much in this writing as he does in other books, but this idea of a calling, right? Being called. But when you were called, did you not answer? Right? Did you answer or did you not? Perhaps softly in a whisper. Not so, Abraham gladly, boldly, trustingly answered out loud, here I am. We read further, and Abraham rose up early in the morning. He got up early. He didn't dilly-dally. He hurried as though to some celebration. And he was at that appointed place, the Mount of Moriah, early in the morning. He said nothing to Sarah, nothing to Eliezer. Silence, right? What is there to say? What could he have said? After all, who could have understood him? Hadn't the test by its very nature exacted an oath of silence from him? So skipping there to the bottom, who gave strength to Abraham's arm? Who kept his right arm raised so that it did not fall helplessly down? Anyone who saw this would be paralyzed. Who gave strength to Abraham's soul so that his eye did not become too clouded to see either Isaac or the ram? He lost himself in his action. He let himself go. It wasn't reflected. He wasn't sort of mediated by his consciousness or his conscience. He just did what he knew was supposed to do. That didn't even make sense. It was absurd. Anyone who saw this would become blind, and yet rare enough though they may be, those who are both paralyzed and blind, still more rare is he who can tell the story and give it its due, right, without sugarcoating it. We know it, all of us. Although I guess not all of us do. A lot of you are like, I don't know this story. I had to sort of explain some of this. Sorry, we all know of it. It was only a trial. Had Abraham doubted as he stood on the mountain in Moriah, had he looked about in indecision, if before drawing the knife he had accidentally caught sight of the ram and God had allowed him to offer it in place of Isaac, then he would have gone home. Everything would have been as before. He would have had Sarah. He would have kept Isaac. And yet how changed. So this is another point, that theme, point, whatever you want to call it, motif that keeps coming up through the reading, is this idea of sometimes things might look the same on the outside, but are different on the inside. So maybe Abraham could have gone through with the trial, but if he would have seen the ram before he put the blade to Isaac's throat, oh, I know. Then he would have been alleviated. He would have known it was a trial. He would have known, I'm not really going to have to kill Isaac. I'll, keep going through with it. The motions would have been the same. He would have been doing the same thing. Just like, I guess, the mother breastfeeding the baby, but she's covering her breast with a cloth. Same positions. The bodies are in the same position. The movements are the same, but you're not really giving milk. It's not the same thing. So that would have been different. For his withdrawal would have been a flight, his deliverance an accident, his reward dishonor. his future perhaps damnation. Then he would have borne witness not to his faith or to God's mercy, but to how dreadful was the journey to the mountain in Moriah. Abraham would not be forgotten, nor the mountain, yet it would not be mentioned like Ararat, where the ark came to land, as a horror. But Ararat was hope, where when Noah landed on that mountain and saw the dove, it was a gleam of hope for a bright future and forgiveness and a new beginning. That's not where Abraham would have landed if he would have hesitated, if he would have seen Isaac's, he would have seen Isaac or the ram first. But he became selfless, became immersed in his faith. Venerable Father Abraham, when you journeyed home from the Mount of Moriah, you needed no speech of praise to console you for what was lost. For in fact, you gained everything and kept Isaac. Was it not so? The Lord never again took him from you. You sat happily at table with him in your tent, as you do in the hereafter in all eternity. Venerable Father Abraham, thousands of years have slipped by since those days, but you need no late coming lover to snatch your memory from the power of oblivion. For every mother tongue commemorates you, and still you reward your lover more gloriously than anyone. You make him blessed hereafter in your bosom. You captivate his eyes and his heart in the here and now with the marvel of your deed. Venerable Father Abraham, second father to the human race, you first saw and bore witness to that tremendous passion. Again, faith is a passion. That tremendous passion that scorns the fearful struggle with the raging elements and the forces of creation in order to struggle with God. Instead, so again, struggle with the raging elements, forces of creation, struggling with God. Remember, the hero is great in proportion to what they struggled with, in proportion to what they hoped for, all these sort of things. This is a recapitulation of that theme. You who first knew the supreme passion, the sacred, pure, and humble expression of the divine madness which pagans admired. Forgive him who speak in your praise if he did not do it correctly. He spoke humbly, seeing it as his heart's desire. He spoke briefly as is fitting. But he will never forget that you needed 100 years to get a son of your old age, against every expectation, that you had to draw the knife before keeping Isaac. He will never forget that in 130 years you got no further than faith, right? Didn't move on, yet stayed with faith. Didn't dwell on it, didn't sit in it, didn't use it as the beginning for some sort of dialectical, intellectual reckoning with one's existence and oneself. He was sort of transparently grounded in the power that created him. Or actually, let me get back to the PowerPoint. I want to make sure I get the wording right on that phrase. If you remember, I gave you a sort of tentative definition that Kierkegaard offers us in one of his other works, where he says that faith is to be transparently grounded in the power that established you. Okay, so yeah, not the power that created him, the power that established him, right? So Abraham is transparently grounded. Faith for him is not the beginning of some endless cycle of grappling with God. Once he struggled and went through that trial and everything becomes clear to him, and he sees the significance and the importance of Isaac and what Isaac means for him, he lives the rest of his days in the temporal world, immersed in faith, transparently grounded in the power that established him. So let's get back to the reading and move on. I don't know how much time we're going to have to get into it, but let's move on to the first Problemata. So I think I mentioned already that the title of the first Problemata is the Preamble from the Heart. There's two more after this, and we're probably not going to have time to cover them, but just so you know, this is one of many. And it begins with probably, this is Kierkegaard is very quotable. So you'll see a lot of Kierkegaard quotes on the internet from time to time. But this is one of them. This is one of kind of a famous passage of his, where he talks about, and this gets real biblical, talking about sort of spiritual bread, right? I think this is actually from Proverbs. He says there's an old proverb. It might be from the what is it? Not Proverbs, the book before Proverbs. I don't know. This is not a class on the Bible, so we won't get too technical here. He says there's an old proverb pertaining to the outward and visible world. It says, only one who works gets bread. Oddly enough, the saying doesn't apply in the world to which it most properly belongs. For the outward world is the subject to the law of imperfection. There it happens time and again that one who gets bread is one who does not work, and that one who sleeps gets it in greater abundance than one who labors. So what is he saying here at the outset? Right, there's an old saying, only one who works gets bread. And it's usually understood to apply to, as he puts it, the outward and visible world. You know, like if you're the foreman at a job site and you see some people being lazy, you're like, get to work. Only those who work get the bread, right? You're going to be the, authoritarian, foreman or whatever, right? The cruel leader, must work. You can't have your pudding if you don't eat your meat. You can't even have meat if you don't do your do the chain gang work, whatever, right? But he makes a point that I would say is definitely true. What do you think? Is this really a good saying? Is it true that the only people that get bread are the ones who work? Is that literally true? Only people who work get bread?
No.
No.
No, not at all.
Right. There's tons of people. Like I take a morning walk every morning, and on my stroll, I sometimes I usually take different routes, but most of the time, 9 times out of 10, I walk by a food bank, right? A Houston food bank. And there's a line of people waiting to get free food. And I guess you could argue they didn't work. I guess they waited in line. Maybe waiting in line is work. But sometimes people don't even have to work for food, right? They can just be sitting there on the corner and some guy just drives up and says, hey, man, you want a taco? I've done that before. Sometimes I order too many tacos and I got an extra taco. And I'm like, hey, homeless guy, you want my extra burrito or my extra taco? And they're like, oh, cool, man. And they didn't work for that. They just were there, right? And sometimes, and I guess those are some examples that aren't too bad. I mean, there's some people that don't do anything and they're just, maybe they sleep all day and their daddy owns the factory. So because daddy owns the factory, they get bread every morning. They don't get just bread, they get cake, right? They're like Madame Curie, let them eat cake. So this doesn't really apply to the outward and visible world. He says, in the outward world, everything belongs to whoever has it. The outward world is subject to the law of indifference. So not only is the outward world imperfect, but it's indifferent. Sometimes people work their ass off and they don't get any fucking bread. And some people sit on their ass all day and have more bread than they could ever need. So here we are. That's the way the world is sometimes. Right, so in the outward world, everything belongs to whoever has it. The outward world is subject to the law of indifference, and the genie of the ring obeys the one who wears it. Whoever he is, right? Whether he's like the bad guy or the good guy, whether he's Noreddin or Aladdin. And whoever holds the world's treasures does so however he came by them. It is otherwise in the world of the spirit. Here there prevails an eternal divine order. Here it does not rain on the just and the unjust alike. Here the sun does not shine on both good and evil. Here only one who works gets bread. And only one who knows anguish finds rest. Only one who descends to the underworld saves the loved one. That's a reference to Orpheus, who in the Greek mythology, he loses his lover, Eurydice, on his wedding day. She dies. So he's a musician who travels to the underworld, bravely seeking her out. And he uses his beautiful voice and sings in his song to convince Hades to allow him his lover back. Right? Only the one who draws the knife gets Isaac. He who will not work does not get bread, but will be deluded, as the gods deluded Orpheus. Because, actually, in the end, Orpheus got screwed. He goes to the underworld, and sure, he convinces Hades to give him his lover back. But Hades says, you got a lot of balls to come in here asking me. But then his song is so pretty that Hades like, all right, man, that song was so beautiful. You can have your wife back, but here's the deal, buddy. You got to leave here and never look back. If you turn your head back to the underworld, even a split second, you'll lose your lover forever. So Orpheus says, I can do that. And he starts to walk up to the surface. As he's trying to exit the underworld, Hades does his best to distract him, sending all sorts of goblins and demons to scream at him, to make him turn around. But he steadfastly, looks forward at as he's ascending to the surface. He sees the light to the entrance to the cave, and as he's just about to exit the cave and get his lover Eurydice back, he hears her voice calling out to him, Orpheus, Orpheus, and he just can't help himself. He turns around to see her for the last time as she descends back to the depths. Like the gods were screwing with him, right? The gods deluded him because he was tender-hearted, not a courageous, but he was a liar player. He was a Nancy boy. That's kind of what he's saying here. By the way, this is funny. I was in my intro to philosophy class. We cover Plato's Symposium, and that's a dialogue where there's a bunch of men sitting around getting drunk, and they all give speeches in praise of love. And the story of Orpheus comes up, and they kind of make the same comment. They say, well, Orpheus didn't really get his love back because he wasn't brave enough. Obviously he plays the lyre. He's one of those, those little fairy boy musicians. So there's this kind of like macho, machismo kind of sentiment there. But no, Abraham was tough. That guy was not, he was no Orpheus. He did not turn around and look at Eurydice when he heard her voice, I guess is the comparison being made here. So here it is here it is no help to have Abraham as one's father, or 17 years of noble ancestry. Of anyone who will not work, here one can say what is written about Israel's virgins. He gives birth to wind. That's, it's referring to a quote from, I think, Isaiah or something, one of the Jewish prophets who talk about, that Israel's virgins will give birth to nothing, to air, because they don't have faith, they lack faith, they've stepped away from God's path. But Abraham did not do that, right? So he earned his spiritual bread, right? He earned he did the work, right? The one who works will give birth to his own father. I think what that's saying, the one who works, it's sort of like you establish that relation to God. You establish that transparent grounding through that ordeal, through, in this case, Abraham walking up the mount in Moriah, willing to sacrifice the son. This is what gives him, this is the work he goes through, and it gives birth to the Father. It gives him a clarification about his relationship to the power that established him. Conventional wisdom aims presumptuously to introduce into the world of spirit that same law of indifference under which the outside world groans. It believes it is enough to have knowledge of large truths. No other work is necessary. This is more of, I think, again, kind of a double meaning, but there's one way of reading it as an attack of the church. That, Kierkegaard is sort of underhandedly talking about how, look, there's one temptation to try to make sense in a sort of universalistic way these stories of this, thousands of years ago, the father of faith, the first person. And it believes that it's enough to have knowledge of large truths. This is, I guess, a knock against probably Catholicism, but he would even probably say a lot of forms of Anglicanism, the sort of more organized versions of Protestantism, the more organized ecclesiastical, that's a technical word, but a church where you've got rank and order and rules and regs and official interpretations, that all these priests and cardinals and bishops, they've all sat around these tables for hours and meticulously read the scripture and try to work it out, okay? And once they arrive at these sort of universal agreed upon interpretations, then all you as a follower have to do is just swallow them and just eat them up. And they've done that work for you, and that's enough. No, not so, says Johannes de Silencio here, right? Oh, no other work's necessary. Well, you don't get your bread that way. It starves to death while everything is transformed into gold. That's kind of I would say a reference. There's no footnote here, but that's a reference to King Midas. Maybe you've heard the story of the greedy king who wanted, he got his wish. He was given a wish, and he said, well, I want to be able to, make everything gold. I want everything I touch to turn into gold. Well, at first it worked, and he was really happy. But what's going to happen to this guy eventually? No one knows the story of King Midas. What happened to King Midas? Turned everything into gold, and then what happens?
Couldn't he not eat?
Right, he can't eat.
What he touched turned into gold.
Yeah, he grabs an apple, he tries to take a bite out of it, and it's like solid, and he breaks his tooth on it. And so there was a funny, like when I was a kid, I remember they did like a Looney Tune version of it. It was kind of funny. But so it's sort of like what the theologians are doing is what King Midas is doing. They're sort of gilding everything with this sort of golden veneer. They're sort of adorning it with this beautiful language and wonderful, skillful craftsmanship of interpretation. But really, at the bottom, there's no nourishment. King Midas can't take a bite of the apple. There's no temporal nourishment, and really no spiritual nourishment. Ultimately, this is not truly faith. This is not what we're talking about. This is not the faith of Abraham, at least. There were many thousands in Greece of the time, countless others in later generations, who knew all the victories of Miltiades. But there was only one who lost sleep over them. There were countless generations that knew the story of Abraham by heart, word for word. How many did it make sleepless? So remember, and this kind of references an earlier part of the reading where he talks about there was once a man, in the Attunement section, there was once a man who heard the story of Abraham, and he couldn't make sense of it. And the more he read it, the more he was confused. The more, obviously, at least I think obviously, he's talking about himself in that passage. But I think here he's reiterating that point, right? He's like, who did this? Who has actually, most of us, I was never brought up in a very religious family. My parents did not really take me to church. I went with my neighbors occasionally out of curiosity, but neither one of my parents were that religious. But I'm imagining those who were taken to church with, maybe your parents made you go every Sunday or, every other Sunday or whatever, or at least on holidays. You hear these stories for the first time in Sunday school, and you just gloss over them. You know, like, okay, Abraham was told to kill his son and he went up the mountain, but it was all just a test. So it's not that bad. Don't worry. You know, he didn't murder his kids. It was just a test. And you kind of hear it and you're like, okay, that's just the story. I'm supposed to believe it. And you move on, you know, you move on and you call yourself a Christian or whatever. But how many of you stop and dwell on that story? And he says, you need to do that. Because this is what faith is, right? You know, how many have actually lost sleep over this? Now, the story of Abraham has the remarkable quality that it will always be glorious, no matter how impoverished our understanding of it. But only, for it's true here too, if we are willing to labor and be heavy laden, right? So again, we've got to do the spiritual work if we want to get the bread. But labor they will not. Like these theologians who try to spin gold around with this. Labor they will not, and yet they still want to understand the story. One speaks in Abraham's honor, but how? By making it commonplace? His greatness was that he so loved God that he was willing to offer him the best he had. Well, that's very true. But best is a vague expression. In word and thought, one can quite safely identify Isaac with the best. And the man who so thinks can very well puff at his pipe as he does so, right? So you're imagining these sort of priests or bishops or philosophers with their pipe, you know, well, Isaac was there. Isaac represents the best, and it's an allegory or a symbol for the whatever, right? You know, and as a listener can very well leisurely stretch out his legs. If the rich young man whom Christ met on the road had sold all his possessions and given them to the poor, we would praise him as we praise all great deeds, but we would not understand even him without some labor. Yet we would not have become yet I guess I said it right the first time. We would not understand even him without some labor, yet he would not have become an Abraham, even if he had given away the best he had. Why is that the case? He's going to explain in the next line, but I want to let y'all jump in. So this is the story of the rich man who asks Jesus, how do I be righteous? And Jesus says something like, well, just follow the commandments. And he's like, well, I did all that. What can I do to be the best possible? And he's like, you want to be the best possible you can be? Well, you got to sell all your riches and give everything you own away and then come follow me. And so even if the rich man did that, that would be amazing. That would be like, whoa, hard to understand, kind of crazy. But it still wouldn't have been as impossible to understand as the story of Abraham. Why? What's the big difference there? Think about it.
I mean, one, you're giving up your only born son, you know, versus possessions.
Right. Possessions are things that could probably be replaced.
Yeah.
You know? Like if you could be super rich, let's say, give up all your wealth, and it might be unlikely, but or maybe the odds are against you, or who knows, depends on the situation, I suppose. But there's a possibility you could get your riches back. You know, if you lose a son, if your son dies, is there a way to get that back? Can you replace it with another Isaac? You know, if someone knocked on your door one day, you woke up in the morning, there's a knock at your door, and you open your door, and some stranger with a briefcase and a business suit, looks all official, says, hey, we're really sorry, but we lost your mom. We don't know what we did with her. She's missing, she's gone. Like, we had her, and now she's like, what do you mean we lost you? But don't worry. We found a woman who looks exactly like her. And she's a professional actress. We told her everything about your mother's history. She knows your mom's biography. She even knows some stuff you don't know about your mom. And she acts like your mom. In fact, you won't even be able to tell the difference. Like, we completely designed her. She's the same height. She's actually born one day before your mom, so she's the same age pretty much. Are you gonna, okay, cool. All right, as long as you got me a replacement, then okay, we're cool. Is that how that works? No. Right? There's something about Isaac, right, that is unreplaceable. Right? Isaac is the only Isaac. I mean, sure, there's other people named Isaac, probably after this guy, but yeah. This is, you know, a man giving up his, if he's rich, that's wow. This dude was rich again. That's a lot. That was, but to ask someone to give up their son, right? That's something completely different, right? And a whole other ballpark we're talking. And so, sorry, I lost my place. I'm trying to find it. Yet anguish is a dangerous affair. Or sorry, what is left out of the Abraham story is the anguish. For while I am under no obligation to money, right? I don't have a sort of obligation to money, right? I don't owe my money anything, right? I don't have a duty to my money. If I give my money away, you might think I'm a fool. You're like, why do you just give your money away? And like, there's a famous story of Wittgenstein. We talked about Wittgenstein briefly at the beginning of the semester. He came from a very wealthy family. I mean, they were uber rich. When his parents died, he inherited, you know, a fortune and gave it all away. Just gave it away. And then like less than a year later, he was selling furniture to pay rent. So people like looked at him like, what a weirdo, like what an eccentric guy. So it's like, you know, you do something like that and it's kind of confusing. You're like, that's weird. But you're not like, how dare Wittgenstein do that to his money? His poor money. What does his money think about? You know, it's like, no, you know, it's his wealth. He do what he wants with it. But a son, right? This is something that, to call this an act of that should be praised, that's something that's not, it doesn't really make sense. It's not something you can sort of make sense of. So again, what's left out of the Abraham story is the anguish. While I'm under no obligation of money, to a son, the father has the highest and most sacred of obligations. Yet anguish is a dangerous affair for the squeamish. So people forget it, notwithstanding they want to talk about Abraham. So this is why we get a sugar-coated, or maybe we just sort of gloss over the story. We don't really dwell on it. We think about it when we hear it in church. Where, oh yeah, Abraham, yeah, next book, next chapter. Let's talk about Isaac and Esau and that, and the journey to Egypt and all that. And we sort of gloss over it. Let's get sleepless over this. Let's lose some sleep over it. He's saying, right? Anybody's having insomnia, or if you're not, you're going to have it after this book, right? He's going to try to make that the case, right? So they talk, and in the course of conversation, they interchange the words Isaac and best. Everything goes excellently. Should someone in the audience be suffering from insomnia, however, there is likely to be the most appalling, most profound, tragicomic understanding, or misunderstanding. He goes home. He wants to do just like Abraham. For the son is certainly the best thing he has. Should that speaker hear word of this, he might go to the man, summon all his clerical authority and shout, loathsome man, dregs of society, what devil has so possessed you that you wanted to murder your own son? So, you know, he's asking, like, what if we're in church one day and the priest is telling us the story of Abraham? What if one of the one of the congregation takes it upon himself to go home and do as Abraham has done? What would the reaction be today?
He'd be jailed, say he was mentally ill.
I don't know any. I mean, there might be some wacky cult leaders out there, like David Koresh type, I don't know, or Jim Jones type, who would be like, yeah, you did good, son. Yeah. But most preachers, priests, pastor, whatever denomination you're in, you know, if this dude killed his son and then the next Sunday went to church and went to his pastor bragging about it, hey, Father, remember that speech you gave last week? Well, guess what I did Sunday after I got home from church? I did just like Abraham, murdered my boy. I gave the best. The priest will say, you're crazy, you're nuts. And this priest who had felt no signs of heat or perspiration while preaching about Abraham would be surprised at the righteous wrath with which he fulminates against that poor man. He would be pleased with himself, for never had he spoken with such pungency and fervor before. So in this sense, now he's got conviction. He's talking about Abraham. He's probably doing, well, today's the day we got to talk about Abraham because, that's in my program and I've got a schedule of readings. And next week we're going to talk about Isaac and the struggle in Egypt. And in order to talk about that, I got to have some background with Abraham. But now that he's like, oh, crap, this isn't like visceral, like, fuck, you killed your son? What the hell am I preaching here? This is what would happen most likely, or very likely reaction. I'm an orator. Sorry, he would say to himself and his wife, this is what the priest might say to them himself. I'm an orator. All I've needed was the opportunity. When I spoke about Abraham on Sunday, I didn't feel at all carried away. And so he's like, damn, I'm good. Like, I got this guy. Like, that might be one reaction. If the same speaker still had some slight excess of wit to spare, he would surely lose it if were the senator replied coolly and with dignity, it was in fact what you yourself preached on Sunday. How could a priest get such an idea into his head? And yet he did so. And the mistake was only that he hadn't known what he was saying. Why doesn't some poet take up situations like these instead of the stuff and nonsense that fills comedies and novels? The comic and the tragic converge on each other here in absolute infinity. The priest's speech, so it's comic in the sense that, this guy completely got the story wrong, tragic in the sense of what it led to, right? And there's way more to say than that. This is not a class on philosophy of art or literature, so I don't want to dwell too much into the philosophical musings on tragedy and comedy and the relationship of the two. Some say comedy is response to the tragic, and that they're basically two sides of the same coin or something like this. But let's see, the comic and the tragic converge here in absolute infinity. The priest's speech was no doubt laughable enough in itself, but became infinitely more so in its consequence, and yet that was quite natural. Or suppose the sinner had acceded without a protest to the priest's reprimand, or that zealous cleric had gone happily home, happy in the knowledge that his effectiveness was not confined to the pulpit, but was above all evident in the irresistible power of his ministry to souls, inspiring the congregation on Sunday, while on Monday, like a cherub with flaming sword, confronting him who by his deed would put that old proverb to shame, which says that the world never practices what the priest preaches. So again, this is kind of sadistic, but there's a way in which maybe the cleric, in all honesty, tragically might get a sort of joy out of this, even though he realizes the horror of such an act that his congregation was capable of. Still kind of pleased. Well, who says that no one practices what I preach, right? Maybe I did reach somebody, not quite the way I might have wanted to, but I've got this power. Should the sinner, on the other hand, not be convinced by the cleric's reprimand, right? When he comes to him and says, hey, I killed my son, and the priest says, that was wrong. And the guy says, wait a minute, maybe you're not such a good priest. He says, so if the sinner does that, if he's not convinced, his situation would be tragic enough, right? Like Andrew said, he's probably sitting in a jail cell at this point. He would no doubt be executed or sent to the madhouse. In short, he would have come into an unhappy relation to so-called reality. Though in another sense, this is kind of a crazy quote, in another sense, I should think that Abraham made him happy. For he who labors does not perish. Because he took the story to heart. Maybe he didn't really arrive at faith, but he didn't pussyfoot around it the way we tend to do, the way most in the congregation do. They sort of half listen. It's probably even worse today. Back in the 1800s when you're at church, you kind of are stuck there. You're a captive audience. You don't have your cell phone. I mean, I'm sure like you go to a church today and when the congregation's bored, they just sort of sit there and watch the game, you know, or whatever's going on. They try to figure it out. You know, how do I alleviate my boredom? Back then, I guess you just sort of get off in your own daydreaming and you sort of just get lost in your thoughts. And so, but this guy, the guy that goes home and kills his son, that dude was listening to the speech, man. That speech spoke to him, probably wrongly and messed up, but in a kind of wacky, messed up way. At least he took the story serious. And I think Johannes is saying we're not, that we're glossing it over. And so we're going to actually have to sort of, I want to end it there. We still got about 10 minutes, but this is a really good place to stop. I think there's a lot more going on here in this section that we need to unpack. There's going to be this relationship between resignation and faith, and sort of this process through which one arrives at faith that involves resignation. And it gets a little deep and complicated. So I don't want to get started on that yet. So I think this is probably a good place to stop. But for next meeting, for next week, I guess it'll be Monday. You got a whole weekend ahead. Try to finish the rest of the reading. I don't think we'll get through it on Monday, but we're going to get deep into it. Try to get through the PDF. So all the way to page, whatever it is, 69, 71, I think is where it ends. Try to wrap it up. And so you'll kind of be a little bit ahead of where we'll be in class, but that's always preferable to being behind. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.